Hello. Uh, thank you for being here. I know it's somewhat late. Uh, I guess it's difficult to get all the agenda for the day and being at this time of day in another session. So thank you for being here. We're going to discuss today how internet governance plays a role in terms of digital economy. So for that, we have three panelists now. There's one of them, Virat Bhatia, who just wrote about an hour ago. He said that he's got the flu, fever, and he's pretty sick, so he cannot join us. But we have Helani Galpaya, representing civil society, Verena Weber from the OECD, and also Pablo Hinojosa from the technical community. So just to start, I'm going to try to provide a framework for our discussion. I hope that all of you participate with questions afterwards. We have also some people connected that are on the platform in WebEx, and we're going to see if they want to participate. So I wanted to give a brief introduction about the topic of the panel, the roundtable that I wanted to propose here, which is the adoption of policies for digital transformation in line with internet governance and how both topics are related and relevant to each other. So I'm going to start by explaining the current situation in Colombia, what we're doing, what we're trying to do, and to set the scene about how developing countries are trying to get to define their own digital transformation policies, and how the implementation of those or the adoption of those policies could affect or not internet governance. So during the last 7 years in Colombia, we've had a pretty quick development of internet adoption. We developed a very large fiber optics network. We connected the whole country. And we have also worked in appropriation initiatives. We have a lot of new uses for the internet and a lot of new people connected to the internet. So we're trying to move from probably just using internet for email and basic stuff to a little bit more productive usage. And after that, the CRC, I'm part of the regulator, the telecom regulator, we published a document in which we're trying to analyze or identify different actions and different initiatives that we would need to start and develop so that we can get the most out of the digitalization transformation in our country in different economic sectors. We call that the regulatory roadmap for the development of the digital economy in Colombia. So there we're proposing a strategy to promote digital transformation for the country. And it's kind of a pioneering study in the region, Latin America. We have seen that there's some difficulty in different countries, mostly developing countries, trying to define the best way in which we can take advantage of the digitalization processes in our country, because we're not used to, we don't have specific processes on innovation, adoption of technology, so it kind of, it's a little bit difficult for us. So as part of this work, we reviewed international landscape of key regulatory and public policy initiatives across the globe so that we could structure the pillars for the digital economy policy in Colombia. We reviewed different countries, including United Kingdom, Australia, Singapore, Chile, and the United States. And we took from them all of the different proposals, recommendations, initiatives, and actions that they have been implementing. And we analyzed different economic sectors. We are a telecom regulator, but we analyzed different sectors, including transportation, tourism, media, financial services, postal services, manufacturing, trying to understand how digitalization works in each one of those specific sectors. So all of us, I guess, in our own countries are trying to decide on how to better adjust to digitalization and how to better take advantage of the internet as a tool for social and economic development. So we have been it's happening in Colombia. We have been decisions that have been taken by different governmental institutions, by different, I don't know, the judiciary, parliament, that probably are not in line with the discussions that we have here at venues such as IGF, discussions related to internet governance. And we were thinking that it would be good to discuss how we could inform those different stakeholders about the decisions and what is being discussed here in this forum, so that we could have some better decisions from their part. And I want to explain that with in an example that we have a decision that was taken a couple of months ago by the Constitutional Court in Colombia. They decided that a specific content that was posted by a citizen needed to be eliminated from internet, from the website that it was posted on. The platform that supported the blog in which it was posted had to register as a telecom operator, even though they are not a telecom operator. And the Ministry of ICTs had to regulate the principles through which all platforms could block specific content affecting goodwill of citizens or companies. So if you see, if you think about this, governmental institutions in charge of ICTs, we can be placed in like a difficult situation, trying to work with other stakeholders like the judiciary, parliament, and also with other governmental institutions on the definition of best policies, so that we can migrate from the traditional economy, the analog economy, to a digital economy. And also we have to balance these decisions with the protection of rights and the way in which internet works as an open and free venue for different market players. So based on this, on the need to promote digital economy and the work that we or any other country in the world has in terms of taking decisions on those policies that would transform digitally their own economies, we formulated a set of questions that probably would be the guide for the discussion today. The first one is if there's an impact on internet governance that might arise from the implementation of these national policies on digitalization. What kind of things could occur, and have any of the attendees to this table have seen in different countries that could affect internet governance? And also, how could the internet governance framework support the adoption of better digitalization policies for our countries, if we can adopt or discuss things within our internet governance discussions to better prepare our countries for the adoption of those digitalization policies. So that is the general framework, and I wanted to start with Helani. I mentioned that she represents civil society. She works with the think tank that covers Asia Pacific, South Asia Pacific. And I want to get your views on those couple of questions, and also if you could give us some examples or cases that you've seen from different countries in the region that you cover, in which you could tell us about how the discussion and what are the key issues that we need to consider in this adoption of policies, and how internet governance could work and be relevant on those discussions.
Yeah, thanks, Juan Manuel. So I think obviously the basic underpinning of a digital economy is the infrastructure, right? So if you look at India's emergence into the digital space as a major player in outsourced software development initially, well, call centers, very low value added into high value added, then outsourced software development, and then into software products and innovation, right? And that's a migration in terms of how much value you can capture as a country. One of the primary drivers way back sort of in the early 2000s was simple network redundancy on the international backhaul. And this sounds very mundane, but international companies who want cross-border sort of, digital work and transfer of data look for redundancy. And there are so many countries in regions that we work in without redundancy in international backhaul. And obviously, then you need good pricing. These are clearly within the control of the regulatory regime of a nation state. So I would say that's a very clear example of something in terms of policy that a government can do. In the case of Sri Lanka, which, and India is at a state where 7% or more of its GDP is coming through the IT-enabled sector. So this is not a small amount for a large country like India, and huge employment generation, so direct economic impact. In Sri Lanka, again, it was initially a very government-led process of identifying the fact that we had the largest per capita number of qualified chartered accountants in the world, and then developing a digital economy strategy where this particular niche market for outsourced account management and accounting work was developed through a multi-stakeholder process where private sector participated, well, not so much civil society, and government worked this out. Let's go a little bit into the labor issues of a different type. So not the people who work in the big software companies, but digital mode 4 trade where the buyer and seller never meet, and individual sellers and individual buyers work across borders to find each other and to strike up a transaction, to do the work, and to transport the goods. I'm talking about online microwork and freelancing markets. This is not insignificant. Outside of America, India is the largest market for online freelancing. Even little Sri Lanka, with 24 million people, our national surveys show that anywhere between 17,000 to 22,000 people work doing online freelancing and microwork. And this is a range of work. At the very low, quite exploitatively priced end, we're talking about 1 cent for ad clicking, really awful work. At the middle end, we're talking $5 to $10 a gig to design logos, to write website content and paragraphs. And at the very high end, we're talking $300 to $700 to do software development, right? The digital economy employment market would not work without good connectivity. But we hear other policy issues, which I think, for example, one of them is payments. So the dominant payment on most of these work platforms is PayPal. But for example, Sri Lanka does not allow PayPal inward remittances because they claim the know your customer requirements employed by PayPal are not good enough to meet the requirements in the country. I think there's also a lot of protectionism through the banks. This is a sector that has to be opened up. And I think there are ways to do that. And the consequence of not having these dominant platforms working across borders is that even though these people are earning really valuable US dollar income, which is really important for these small countries, they're not allowed to bring it into the country. Or if they want to, they need to use other methods which basically take away almost 50% of their earning in the middle management in terms of charges, compared to PayPal, which also keeps a cut, but significantly lower than other methods, right? So this is a non-digital policy that's really affecting the digital sector. And let me do my last thing about data. I think if the digital economy is to be really meaningful, it has to actually impact other non-digital sectors of a country. So we can't just focus on the digital economy, which is important. We need to worry about the ICT sector, the digitalized sector, but let's go beyond. How can the digital economy contribute? And I think one of the key ways is through data. We have countries where sort of things like IoT, Internet of Things, and having sensors on buses and everywhere, you know, transporting, giving data real time, these are sort of dreams that are going to come in the next decade for us, right? What we have in the form of a digital trace is the mobile phone signal that people generate when they walk around with a mobile phone. And there's multiple streams of data that come through that. The call detail records tell where you were if you were on an active internet session, SMS, or a call. And a visitor location registry tells where people were and doing what, even if you didn't have an active call, active session going on. Every time you move, every time you're anywhere. So this can be combined with whole lots of other administrative data like population data, for example, vegetation data, to do a whole lot of things in non-ICT sectors. And one thing we are doing is transport planning, working, sort of helping as outsider, the Colombo Megapolis Development Plan, which is the biggest infrastructure development project Sri Lanka has going at the moment, because they need to know where people live, where they come from, where do I put my multimodal transport hubs where people can come and park, get into a train, or come by train, transport into a bus or an auto rickshaw. We need to understand how this happens real time. We need to understand where the traffic congestion hotspots are. You can do this with the cell phone signals because even poor people in our countries have cell phones. There's very high penetration of cell phones. In fact, they don't have credit cards, so we can't do good credit scoring, but we know where people move. So what we have done is to take historical and pseudonymized, so we don't know who these people are, call detail records. These are trillions of records every week from mobile phone operators, multiple mobile phone operators in Sri Lanka, for example, similarly in Bangladesh, etc. And identify and running sort of complicated algorithm with huge sort of hardware stacks to look at where people live, where they work, where they move to, what the population densities are in real time, not based on every 10 years of a census that comes out. The second thing is it helps you identify poor people are when you combine sophisticated algorithms which include the reload patterns and sort of Google nighttime lights and the call detail records. Where identifying where poor people live is really important in terms of service delivery. Even if you want to deliver e-gov services, where do you put the kiosks? You need to really identify this, right? So this is connecting the digital and non-digital economy of identifying where poor people live. The third is disease. So Sri Lanka, again, just to stick to Sri Lanka, has endemic dengue. This is a malaria-like disease which kills thousands of people every year. Unfortunately, it's a new disease which is widely spread, and now it's endemic. The biggest determinant of how this disease is spread is, like malaria, is related to where people move and whether there are these particular types of mosquitoes. Where people move, the best indicator of that, again, is the cell phone digital trace that people leave as they're going about their daily business. So our predictive models have been as good in identifying where diseases will occur when we compare it to actually 6 months later where diseases did occur. So imagine if the government actually used our data 6 months in advance to prepare, because then the health inspectors can go and eliminate the mosquitoes. You don't stop the people from going, but you eliminate mosquitoes in these areas, right, which are predicted to have high disease. So this are just sort of an example of a way where the digital economy can directly contribute to the efficient functioning of other sectors of the economy. The biggest problems, again, are really internet governance issues here. One is data sharing. And privacy is a real concern, right? There's a lot of data out there that even we could use potentially that identifies individual people. Now, if I were not a public interest research institution, I could do amazing things with this and make money. So I take that data without the personally identifiable information. But there are no sort of easy mechanisms to actually get that data and remove that. And how do I share, and what kind of legally binding contracts do I sign? What are the institutional mechanisms for data sharing are really tough. From the day we started negotiating with telecom operators, it was exactly 24 months until we got the first terabyte of data. This is a really long time, and we don't have the energy to go through this. This is in Sri Lanka. It took as long in Bangladesh. So we need to work out mechanisms where data can be shared. We need to know which data is dangerous and should be protected and not shared, and how that should be shared, versus a whole lot of data that can be shared, which is not being shared because people are afraid the privacy label is put on. But weather data, there's nothing private about weather data, right? But even that's not being shared. I think second, what can you move in and out of countries in terms of, just for us, analyzing this data? The cheapest thing for me would be to put this on Amazon Web Services and use computational power that I can buy for very cheap to analyze this data. However, I'm prevented from by law, from moving that outside, hosting that outside. So instead, in our little office, I have to buy air conditioners, backup generators, run a Hadoop cluster right? I now do this in Bangladesh. Now, the Bangladesh data cannot come and reside in the server that I have in Sri Lanka. So now I'm replicating exactly that, paying enormous amounts of money to the few data scientists we can offer, transferring donor money to the hands of the airlines, flying back and forth in order to analyze this data. And this is for public interest. The governments in these countries are using it. So cross-border data transfer, what's allowed and not, is another policy issue that is not solved. And I'll stop there.
Just to add to that, it sounds pretty interesting and very good question. Do you think that government should have the priority in accessing that kind of information? Mobile operators could use that information to, I don't know, sell it or provide it to anyone else. Should governments have any priority on accessing that information just for social or that kind of purposes?
Look, the not nice answer is government can get this data if they want to, right? I mean, we went through a civil war where people who were not preferred by the government were tracked using mobile network data and triangulation. Okay. So governments can always demand this data in a very privacy and human rights violating way. So that is not a question, that's not right? However, to your broader point, is that yes, I think we need mechanisms. I have no problems with government getting this data. In fact, they should have a priority. But the problem in certainly the countries we work in is they don't have data scientists. They don't have the capacity to actually do anything useful with this data. And that's the bigger problem, which is why then you need academia and civil society to come into this and work on this data. Certainly long-term government capacity needs to be developed, but I can tell you in the governments we work in, there are no data scientists, right? There are not even good statisticians. So this is really, really a hard thing, which is why sort of this, multidisciplinary approaches are needed.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Verena, I know that OECD is working on a very comprehensive project which is called Going Digital. There was a discussion yesterday about that. And OECD is trying to formulate a set of guidelines for countries to adopt policies on digital transformation. What have you seen from those studies at OECD? The key issues that countries need to address in order to get to foster digitalization in their own economies, and how can that affect internet governance in their own countries and to avoid getting to a situation in which government has access to information that may be private and try to use it inappropriately?
Thank you, Juan Manuel. And as you mentioned, we're currently having a huge project at the OECD, which is Going Digital. So why are we having this project? Because our member countries asked us how to go about the digitalization of the entire economy. So as some of you know, we have been coming to the IGF, I think, since its beginning, and where we had like a focus on internet governance. And this is also something we applied within the OECD, so we put a multi-stakeholder approach from the IGF to the way we work. So at our table, we are having civil society, private sector, the internet technical community, and the trade unions. So what we're trying to do with this project are three things. One is we're trying to understand what it means. What does it mean, the digitalization of the economy? And what are the effects that this has on the economy as a whole and society? So for the first time, we're trying to working horizontally. So basically, the OECD is organized in different committees. So my committee, for instance, is the Committee for Digital Economy. And we're working with the Committee for Education. We're working with the Trade Committee. We are working with our colleagues on taxation to develop a holistic approach. So that means, on the one hand, we're asking ourselves what is happening in the different sectors. So we're looking at, for instance, digitalization in the energy sector. We're looking at driverless road transport and transportation. We're looking at tax challenges. We're looking at what does that mean for the future skills and demand. So we're doing this vertical work in all of the committees. But then what we're also aiming to do is to provide policymakers the tools needed for forward whole of government response. So basically, at this stage, we're trying internally, how to make this work from an institutional perspective. And we tried then to give government some propositions on how they could do this on a country level. So what would they need? What would be the institutional setting? What would need to change? And the third aim we're having with this project is to help overcome the gap between technology and policy. So this is it in a nutshell, I would say.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. We also have Pablo, who represents the technical community. And I want to ask Pablo, what do you think in terms of the model that has been used for the discussions of internet governance can be utilized within any country in trying to define what are the best ways to promote digitalization, and how could I guess the venues in which internet governance discussions are taking place could serve as a starting point for the discussion with different stakeholders about these kind of policies and decisions that need to be taken by governments, so that they can get to the best out of the needs and proposals from those stakeholders to build up a digitalization policy that works for the country.
Thank you kindly for the invitation to be here. It's an honor, and it's a bit late, but I'm happy to see a good group of people attending these discussions. My name is Pablo. I work for APNIC. It is the regional internet registry in Asia Pacific. We distribute IP addresses in 56 economies all throughout. So we basically attend a logical layer of the internet, even below the infrastructure layer. So when you talk about sort of the digital economy and policies around that for digitalization, it goes well above sort of the area of the work that we do in terms of servicing around 16,000 networks, mostly internet service providers with their IP addresses needs. So I was thinking really hard, sort of, what can I contribute to this discussion? And indeed, the question that you ask, I find it relevant, and in a way, I think we can contribute to that, because the policies for allocating IP addresses are made in a bottom-up model. They are community-based, and they are the network operators are the ones that decide how we, the registry, allocate those addresses back to them. And it's quite an interesting model. It's a 25-year-old model, so it is a proven model in a way. It precedes the ICANN model as well, the one from the regional internet registries. And it is very much based in the technical community. Later on, after we started our operations, we took part, and we were very much involved in the process of the World Summit on the Information Society, where actually the principles for multi-stakeholder participation were somehow recognized by the governments at a UN setting. And from there, obviously, comes the IGF, the Internet Governance Forum, where we have also been active since inception. And obviously, sort of there is no one single characterization of a multi-stakeholder model. And the prime example that has been quoted multiple times is obviously ICANN. And ICANN was at the epicenter of the discussions during the WSIS time. Particularly because of the role of the government of the United States in the IANA functions. So it is also kind of a strange sort of circle of life that very recently, just last year, we concluded a process in a multi-stakeholder setting to develop a plan to transfer the IANA functions from government oversight to an oversight by the multi-stakeholder community. And I think that is a good example, and there are more examples. So the RIRs are one, the ICANN policy development process is another, the IANA transition process is another, there was the Net Mundial initiative, which was another, and more sort of these sort of multi-stakeholder settings are having a go in decision-making, policy decision-making processes as well. So my suggestion here would be that there is value of considering the views from the technical community and from other stakeholder groups into the decision-making process before you take decisions that ultimately will have an impact or will affect the operations of the network at many different levels, not only at the higher level of the digital economy or the applications or the digitalization policies.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, with that introduction to the topic by our speakers, is there any question from the audience, anything that you would like to ask? Yes.
Yes, I have a question for, I think, each of the presenters here, panelists. First, Verona, so what's the vision that OECD draws in terms of the digital economy, or even the OECD is taking, considering internet governance in their picture of digital economy? That's my first question. And another question for Pablo is that, so is there, I don't know about this, but is there any gap between the way in which APNIC has been doing and the requests from private actors? So I don't know, so the private actors are obviously going ahead or might ask some new requests to, for APNIC should reflect. So, if there's any gap between, those two, so traditional way of doing, a way of APNIC doing, and then private actors' new requests because of the technical development. And lastly, I have a question for Helani as well. So, you've been very well talking and explaining the realities, but I wonder, if you could, I would be glad to hear how these civil society actors are engaging with international organizations or intergovernmental organizations such as OECD, like discussed.
So you asked about the regional approach, right?
Or just the vision of the OECD in terms
the vision.
Yes.
The vision.
So, yeah.
Our vision is to, one, develop an integrated framework. So we're currently working with our country, with our member countries to develop what is called a policy framework. And the current draft we're having is, okay, what are the key building blocks? So we start with access, and Helani mentioned it. I mean, that's a necessary condition, right, to make the digital economy work. And we are far from being there. And this is also true for OECD countries. Then we have a block that is dealing with, okay, what needs to be done in terms of adoption? So the use, what kind of security and privacy framework do you need? How will the way people work change? So that is like the second building block. We have a third block, which is dealing with digital government. So how does, the government needs to kind of reinvent itself for the digital economy, and how should the strategy be done? And then this is our last layer, is the strategy. So that's what we're doing across all member countries, and in parallel, we're testing this methodology, whether it works. So we're having 2 pilot countries. One of them is Sweden, the other one is Colombia, where we're currently undertaking a digitalization review, where we're trying to apply this model and analyze the digitalization of the economy and the response of the institutions in those countries.
Just one more thing. So I'm in Tay, by the way. So in that picture or in that vision, is there some sort of an internet governance piece? So how OECD is trying to, interact with internet governance organizations or internet governance people?
I would say the internet governance piece is how we go about it. This is like how we work with other stakeholders. To develop this framework, we're working with the civil society. I mentioned technical community, the private sector. So to have like a joint approach. So not only a government approach, but an approach that is kind of agreed by all the stakeholders. And then, of course, you'll see some bits of pieces that you see in the internet governance discussion that you also see in the discussion of the digitalization of the economy, and so, such as like how to improve access to the internet, how to guarantee privacy and security. So I would say you have quite some overlap in the both concepts.
Pablo?
So if I understood your question right, is how sort of a multi-stakeholder approach differs from a strictly private sector-led decision-making process, right?
Yes, sir.
And obviously, I think it is an important question that might have elements around efficiency or expediency or how democratic the decision-making process is or how inclusive it is. And in each of these parts, you need to balance out sort of how long it will take for multi-party discussions to agree on an outcome, and how efficient that process can be, how inclusive that process needs to be, and what will be the algorithm to process sort of all these different views, and what will be the aggregation of interests that will lead towards a satisfactory decision. That obviously in many cases is not efficient if you would like to have a decision in a week's time. It takes long, and it takes a lot of energy. It's just like Bitcoin, it consumes a lot of energy to process all of these. But on the other hand, there is the legitimacy of the outcome. There is the value of the decision and how it will stand the test of time, or it will stand the test of implementation simply. Because having all these actors' interest included in that decision-making process will probably make that decision a better one. And I don't think there is a recipe or a model which is just one single standardized one that will tell you this is the way that you should do it. I think it depends a lot on also the culture of participation, also on the feasibility of participation. Sometimes you can have an open process, but then there are enormous barriers of or constraints to participate. I don't have a single answer, but I can just say that at least from the very sort of narrow technical scope of IP addressing policy decision making, we have had a model for more than 25 years, which is participatory, private sector led, and community based.
So if you think about sort of government engagement in with international organizations, I think there's a very mixed picture. So you will see, obviously everyone wants to be in the rich people's club, which is OECD, right? The rich country club. So India will very enthusiastically engage. I think when it's needed, you will actually have the Indian, sort of the diplomatic corps engaging at other fora that are really important to internet governance, right? Like WIPO on intellectual property, on UNCTAD or WTO on trade and e-commerce issues. They will engage, and in fact, sort of they will very strongly engage and represent their sort of interest. And even when you think about like sort of this current debate on where should internet governance rules be made, like the whole issue about enhanced cooperation, even that the Indian government is quite active. And I think that's partly possibly because there's national processes where civil society and everyone can give input into. So India, for example, the telecom regulator, I would say, has really, really good consultation processes, not just about publishing things and asking for people, anyone, it's open to everybody giving input back into proposed legislations, or if they're thinking about doing something. And then there's commentary about that from the regulator, and in the final document, they actually need to say why certain viewpoints were not taken into account. So it's quite a rich process for civil society and others to engage. But then Indian civil society doesn't just engage there, right? I mean, if you go to the big debates, for example, on enhanced cooperation and internet governance, Indian civil society is one of the strongest voices. They sit on the working group on enhanced cooperation, for example, right? Civil society, they are quite strong. Now, the other countries in South Asia, I would say the best way of saying that is they have a very mixed record of engaging internationally, right? And some of these are practical, as you said. It's not easy to come to these fora and actually get a speaking slot. And also it's related to not having the local engagement forum. So for example, how can civil society give input at the local level, which is then taken by the governments into international level? Those are less well defined in many countries, and that's a problem in how you different sectors engage with these international debates.
Thank you, Eleni. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, actually, this question is from the native, from the OECD. Actually, I was just curious, is there any regulatory challenge as a result of the digital economy? Because a large part of digital economy is about a shared economy, kind of the shared economy, like shared resources, shared platform, big platforms. So some people actually mention about like a regulatory challenge, for example, how to protect the individuals, like insurance issues, safety issues, these kind of issues. So because we observe it in China, in other regions, So I'm just curious. Do you have any, have you encountered a similar issue in the OECD? The policy your plan, your vision. Yeah. Thank you.
The short answer, there are loads. So, and I would say on different levels. So a lot of our member countries are currently looking at how to improve their regulatory framework when it comes to access policy, right? Improving access to communication services. So we have some thinking of the notion of a level playing field, if there is a need to deregulate, what else needs to be done in regulation to facilitate access to new entrants and to foster competition. So this is an area where I think our member countries have been working on for many, many years, and where still work is to be done. We also see some new developments. For instance, we're seeing the first wireless wholesale access network in Mexico among all OECD countries. So Mexico is currently going ahead with this project. So this is a purely wholesale access model where the company that is building this network cannot sell to end consumers. So this is very interesting, and we're following this model, and we think that, so we will need to see what this means in terms of further accommodating regulation. Then you mentioned platforms. So we are currently having a study that is looking at platforms. So if you wait for another couple of months, we'll have some first results there. And then, as I mentioned, we have a lot of other areas in the OECD that are working on the question what digitalization means in terms of adapting, I would say, the legal and regulatory framework. So we have colleagues in transportation looking at what it means to have driverless and automated cars. We have colleagues in our tech center that are looking at how do you need to modify the way, you know, the tax regime is done. We have colleagues in the skills area that look at, you know, what should governments need to do to make sure, you know, that people are prepared for the digital economy. So these are some examples.
Just to add to that, I work for the regulator, telecom regulator in Colombia. So what we found out from all of these discussion inside of our country is that as a telecom regulator, we tend to disappear. And the thing is, you should not regulate internet, so your regulatory functions would disappear in time. Everything is moving towards internet, so you would tend to not have to regulate. So we're trying to move towards a regime in which we deregulate or work with the different stakeholders and market players so that they can propose the way in which regulations should be imposed, probably based on principles and like basic rules that don't generate additional obligations to market players. And another thing related to platforms is that we, in the telecom industry, we have different companies, video streaming services that compete with traditional TV subscription, that we need to analyze those kind of situations and how they become new market players. So we've done like 2 or 3 different demand studies in the last couple of years, trying to identify how much one of these platforms is a substitute to the traditional services. And based on that, based on the situation that what we've seen from the industry, we've got to a point in which we know that we cannot regulate. As you said, we probably need to level the playing field and try to deregulate the traditional market players so that they can adjust to the new environment. And we're trying to generate, in the study that I mentioned at the beginning, methodological guide for other regulators that, for example, transportation regulator in Colombia has taken a decision on not allowing platforms to provide transportation services. So it happens in many of our countries. So we're trying to recommend those other regulators from other economic sectors to change their view on how digital actors get involved in the market and how to change the way in which you, for example, analyze market definition so that you adjust for the presence of digital market players and you get them into the whole value chain of your industry. So I guess there are a lot of challenges, as Verena said. I guess none of us has the exact answer, and there are things to be done. There are a lot of things to be done. Any other question from the audience?
Can I? Cláudio Lucena, Paraíba State University in Brazil, FCT, Portugal. I know it's not a specific panel on jobs, but you're projecting internet governance in terms of digital economy. And Verena just mentioned that part of the work is checking out if people are ready for this digital economy, and it touches jobs too. So are you thinking of moving forward in analyzing the impact of this digital economy in jobs and alternatives if they are not as much as a digital economy will need?
Okay, so that's not my area of expertise, so that's my colleagues' area of expertise, but I can give you my card and have a look at our website because they recently published a report on computers and the future of skill demand, where they're addressing those kind of issues. So I can point you that publication and you'll find more information there. So this is one work stream. The other work stream is we have our colleagues from education. They are testing both the digital skills of students in schools, and they are also, and this is, so that's more recent than the other one. The other one is in the context of PISA. They are also testing the digital skills of adults. And we really have an issue in the OECD, and we have a huge gap when it comes to different age groups, etc. So this would be another work stream the OECD is working on.
Paulo Tavares, I'm from Brazil, Recife. It's from OECD. what is the focus of the OECD discussions when analyzing the taxation of digital economy business?
So again, we just prepared a nice report on this, which is called Addressing the Tax Challenges of the Digital Economy. So I can give you more information in my card after the meeting, and I can share the report with you.
Anyone else? Any question? Okay, now, yeah.
Good afternoon. My name is Julian Casasbuenas. I'm from Colombia, and I work for a non-for-profit organization, and they use strategic uses of internet. And I'm wondering if in this analysis of digital economy, it's also taking into consideration not only the economic factor, but when applying digital projects that reaches the grassroots communities. And for instance, in appropriation of technology, we have seen in some analysis in Colombia that for 1 peso that is invested, the local economies can enter in a dynamic where they can produce 3 pesos for each peso invested. Is this analysis included in all this digital economy at all, or is just based on economic issues? No, I don't know if it's clear.
You want to respond to that?
I didn't understand the question, actually. I didn't quite understand the question, sorry.
If he's asking if there's, if in the discussion about digitalization, how investment from the government, for example, can generate a
Like social development.
social and multiplicative effect.
Effects,
Do
yeah.
you have studies looking at this?
No, I mean, I haven't done modeling on this, but clearly this is a huge part of the equation in developing country governments invest in digital anything, right? So in the case of India, the multiplicative effects of the investment made in the infrastructure are really clear. That's 7% of GDP, right? And in fact, that was with very little government investment because that was a lot of private sector provision. So it was actually a good model, right? I think the sort of the business case is harder now when you get to rural areas where the population may be less dense. In the infrastructure case, the private sector is not willing to go, and then the private sector may not in the short term reap the benefits of investing in infrastructure because, you know, if somebody, you know, it's not the same part of the private sector that benefits. So the business case for what that multiplicative effect is very clear for a government, less so for a private sector when you're pushing the boundaries, for example, in connectivity, right?
Okay. Okay, I guess if there's any additional question. Okay, I'm gonna do a very brief review of the things that we discussed today. We talked about good connectivity. We need good connectivity to connect people so that we can country digitize in some way. Helani talked about the need to provide avenues for different ways of payment so that you can promote, I don't know, e-commerce transactions. Mostly in countries, developing countries where we don't have as much people that use financial services like formally. And also a very important point that you raised about data and how data could be used by governments to provide some information and taking decisions regarding, for example, disease control and things like that. So that we could use that data, obviously with some issues that need to be dealt with regarding data sharing, hosting of that data. That is one of the discussions, most important discussions about where do you host the data if it's in your country or other countries, and what are the rules applying to those data that you have from your citizens. Verena talked about the importance of having a holistic approach to digital economy and how governments should have that holistic approach in terms of the way in which they promote digitalization, digital transformation in their own economies and every economic sector. And I guess the last point, very important, made by Pablo about how to use the discussion model used in internet governance to promote participation of different stakeholder groups in the decision-making process about these policies regarding digital transformation and how we can get to better solutions, probably. Sometimes with a lot more work for that discussion process, but probably better decisions at the end in terms of policies. So I don't know if you have anything else to conclude, but I guess that's like a very brief resume of the things that we have discussed. Thank you very much, all of you, for your participation. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Sure.
You know what, the payments, we have a study on e-commerce.